An explorer sets out for the Andes Mountains, defying the biting cold and the silence that seem to watch over his every step. Amidst snow-capped mountains and treacherous trails, his presence becomes a whisper before the immensity. What was supposed to be just another expedition ends up being marked as his last recorded journey. If you enjoy this kind of mystery, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow each revelation. The first days in the Andes were a true test of limits. It wasn't enough to simply have the courage to move forward. One had to contend with the invisible harshness of the thin air that burned the lungs with every breath. The explorer felt short of breath, as if each breath were borrowed from the mountain itself. The cold, in turn, wasn't content with freezing the surface of the skin. It seemed to infiltrate the bones, stealing energy, clarity of thought, and even the sense of time. Narrow, treacherous trails turned each step into a silent pact between life and the abyss. One careless step was all it took for everything to end in seconds. It's no wonder many climbers describe altitude as a living force, something that not only challenges but also judges. His traveling companions began to notice clear signs of wear and tear. The sweat quickly turning to ice, his trembling hands, as he gripped his staff, his fixed gaze trying to hide his fear. Nothing went unnoticed. Some guides murmured among themselves that he wouldn't last long in that condition. And his worst enemy, everyone knew, wasn't just the snow or the lack of oxygen, but the psychological toll of being surrounded by absolute silence. It's at this point that solitude becomes a relentless adversary. When every sound, the wind, the crunch of a boot in the snow, the distant crack of a stone, seems to portend danger. Anyone who's walked alone on a deserted road at dusk knows how cruel the mind can be, creating ghosts where none exist. Now imagine that feeling multiplied by the vastness of the Andes. While some tried to motivate him, others judged him harshly. One colleague even said his insistence on continuing was reckless, almost inviting disaster. The explorer, however, seemed to carry something beyond the simple desire to conquer a mountain. There was a strange gleam in his eyes, as if he sought more than the summit. He sought to prove something to himself, or perhaps to the world that awaited him back. This tension between determination and physical exhaustion created a tense atmosphere in the group. It was like watching a rope being stretched to its limit, about to snap. Many no longer saw this as just an expedition, but as a camp where the fear of death and the desire for conquest clashed every minute. And here the most intriguing part reveals itself. When everyone thought he would retreat, the explorer pressed on. His steps, even if hesitant, challenged both his companions and the very logic of survival. This persistence left everyone with an ambiguous feeling, both admiration and unease. How could anyone insist on moving forward when every sign screamed to give up? Was it genuine courage or just blindness to danger? Doubt spread through the group like a shadow, and every glance cast at him carried not only criticism, but also a strange omen. After all, in the mountains, when a man insists on defying nature without bowing, something inevitably happens. There was something about the way time seemed to drag at those altitudes. Each day became a silent battle against exhaustion, against the merciless biting cold, and against his own mind, which whispered at every moment, "Go back while there's still time." The group had grown accustomed to the heavy pace of the trek, but the explorer always seemed to carry an additional burden, something no one could fully decipher. Until one event changed everything, the last record he left behind. This record wasn't a mere detail, but a milestone. Imagine opening a diary and finding the last words of someone who, from then on, would disappear without a trace. Or holding a camera with the last photograph taken before the silence of the mountain swallowed its protagonist. Whichever version you choose to believe, both carry the same weight. That of a real, concrete trace that has traversed time to remind us that, at that specific point, he was still alive. The document found, some say it was a torn page from a notebook. Others insist it was a black and white photograph of a previously uncatalogued slope, contained details that at first glance might go unnoticed. But for those familiar with the nature of the Andes, every line, every word, every shadow recorded carried a silent cry of meaning. It wasn't just proof that he had been there. It was also the seed of a doubt that would multiply for years. Did he choose to move forward, or was he driven by circumstances? Among the expedition's companions, the impact was immediate. Some felt a pang of admiration. There was something almost heroic in persisting in the face of such adversity. Others, however, interpreted it as proof of recklessness, a stubborn gesture that would condemn not only themselves, but also the morale of the group left behind. The record brought to light a clash of perspectives: courage or madness, determination or self-sabotage. And this conflict would not be limited to those frozen days. It would fuel debates, theories, and legends that would span decades. The curious thing is that this last entry seemed to contain signs that he had penetrated even more unexplored territory, as if he had not been content with the known paths. A narrow valley, a cleft between peaks never seen on maps of the time, or perhaps an enigmatic symbol scrawled in his notes. No one knows for sure. The fact is that somehow he left clues that he was going further, as if he had answered an inner calling no one else could hear. This raises an inevitable question. Was he seeking a geographical conquest, or trying to fill an existential void that consumed him? This ambiguity is what keeps history alive. It's like reading Amelia Earhart's last letters before she disappeared in the Pacific, or the final records of Mallory's team on Everest. They're not just words or images. They're reliquaries of a mind in transition between life and eternity. They force us to reflect on why human beings insist on pushing limits. Is it the search for glory? For immortality? Or just a desperate attempt to silence one's own fear? And if we consider practical examples, it's almost like observing someone who, even amidst the chaos of their life, insists on risking everything on a bold project, whether it's starting a company in the midst of a crisis or leaving a secure job to pursue an uncertain dream. Many would call this madness, others courage. The line that separates one concept from the other is extremely thin, and perhaps that's precisely where the essence of the mystery lies. The explorer, by leaving his last record, not only marked his physical presence but also left us a reflection of our own human condition, the eternal struggle between prudence and the desire to go further. This record, when released years later, rekindled hope. For the family, it was a thread of life, proof that to some extent he had been there, conscious and active. For experts, it was a puzzle. How to interpret those signals? For the curious, it fueled theories ranging from natural accidents to supernatural hypotheses. After all, how to explain the decision to delve even deeper into territory that had already proven hostile? Some say he fell victim to a sudden fall. Others believe he decided to withdraw on purpose, perhaps searching for something he never confessed aloud. His wife, who carried the pain of his absence for years, always referred to the last record with a mixture of pride and anger. pride in seeing in him the indomitable flame of a man who would not bow, anger in knowing that this same flame led to his disappearance. And so the question remains, was it a conscious choice or the result of an inevitable accident? There is no clear answer. What remains is the feeling that, by leaving this last trace, he invited us to follow him into the unknown, even if only with our imagination. And let's face it, that's exactly where the narrative hooks the viewer, because just when we think we understand someone's motivations, a detail emerges that forces us to reevaluate everything. The final entry wasn't just a period. It was a comma that opened the door to theories, hypotheses, and a search that wouldn't be limited to days or weeks. It would extend for years, transforming into a veritable investigative escalation. If this enigma already has you scratching your head, wait until you see how the official search unfolded. The disappearance went from being just a personal drama to a challenge for entire teams who would face the immensity of the Andes. Like and subscribe to the channel to follow this journey, because the mystery is just beginning. When the explorer disappeared, time seemed to be running out. The first hours of the search were intense, filled with hope and a certain optimism. Many believed he was still in some makeshift shelter, braving the cold, waiting for the weather to improve before moving again. Helicopters flew over the valleys. Rescue teams armed with ropes and flashlights blazed the trails, and radios blared constantly with rapid instructions and reports of sightings that, minutes later, proved to be mere illusions. The mountain range, however, maintained its implacable silence, as if to prove that it was the one who dictated the rules of the game. As the days passed, the operation intensified. Men and women accustomed to high-altitude rescues knew that every minute mattered, but they also understood the cold mathematical nature of the situation. After a certain amount of time exposed to those conditions, the chance of survival plummeted to almost zero. This duality corroded the hearts of family members who watched from afar, and also of expedition companions who found themselves torn between hope and resignation. It's curious how, when faced with someone's disappearance, human beings create internal narratives. Some envision a triumphant reunion, others already preparing their minds for inevitable mourning. The searches took on dramatic overtones. Each night without results increased the feeling of helplessness. The cold wind, which had previously been merely a feature of the scenery, now seemed to mock human efforts, erasing footprints, covering trails, altering the landscape as if rearranging a chessboard. An experienced guide once said that the mountain chooses who it guards. It was his way of explaining why so many bodies are never found, even in places where theoretically there was no way they could have completely disappeared. This thought, though poetic, carried a suffocating weight. What if the explorer were just another one of those cases? Official teams reinforced the search with detailed maps, aerial images, and even dogs trained to identify scents amid the snow. Still, the Andes displayed a cruel ability to hide any trace. At times, small signs lit sparks of hope. A mark in the snow, a piece of fabric caught on a rock, something that might indicate their passage. But invariably these clues dissolved when confirmation was impossible. What was hope in the morning turned to frustration by nightfall. Meanwhile, the press was beginning to pay attention to the case. Headlines appeared in local newspapers and soon after, international ones. The disappearance was no longer just a personal tragedy or an isolated search. It had become a public spectacle, watched by thousands of people who saw the episode as a reflection of the eternal struggle between man and nature. Commentators debated on radio shows whether the explorer had been reckless whether the expedition was poorly planned or whether there was something beyond human comprehension behind the disappearance. The debate grew stronger, and the more they talked, the deeper the mystery deepened. The impact on the family was devastating. His wife, who anxiously awaited a call each night with good news, saw her hopes slowly dwindle. In emotional interviews, she insisted that he was strong, determined, and that he would return. But behind the scenes, fatigue and grief consumed her. Her children, some still young, would grow up carrying this absence like an invisible scar, remembering not only their departed father but the myth that had formed around him. And it is here that we realize a curious fact. The more time passed without answers, the more he ceased to be just a man and became a legend. The escalating search also exposed the contrast between human resilience and the mountain range's grandeur. No matter how far they advanced, the feeling was that the mountain was always one step ahead, reshaping the landscape, hiding secrets. One of the rescue team leaders even said, "Every day we return without answers, it seems like the mountain range laughs at our persistence." Harsh words, but they summed up the impotence of that moment. And as the weeks turned into months, the tone of the operation changed. The talk was no longer of rescue, but of recovery. The goal shifted from finding the man alive to at least giving his family the chance for a dignified burial. But even this minimal expectation proved unattainable. The explorer seemed to have merged with the landscape itself, as if the snow had claimed him forever. This emptiness, this lack of closure, was what transformed the disappearance into a mystery, greater than the search itself. Because it was no longer about finding a body, it was about understanding what had really happened. It was at this point that the first alternative theories emerged, contradictory versions that would clash with family members, colleagues, and authorities. But that's a topic for the next chapter, where the story ceases to be just a tragedy and becomes an enigma that spans generations. As the months dragged on and no answers emerged, the mystery ceased to be merely a technical matter for rescue teams and became a human story, full of pain, clashing versions, and even rivalries. The explorer's disappearance wasn't just about snow-capped mountains or treacherous trails. It was about people, emotions, and conflicting truths. At this point in the narrative, characters enter the scene who would add new layers to the enigma, each bringing their own perspective, hope, or judgment. His wife was undoubtedly the most striking figure. For weeks, she remained in front of the media, her expression firm and her words filled with faith. "He'll come back," she repeated, as if refusing to acknowledge the tragedy was a way to keep him alive. There was pain in her voice, but also a kind of quiet determination that impressed even the most skeptical reporters. Yet, behind the scenes, close family members commented that she wavered between hope and anger. Hope of finding him again, anger that he had chosen to risk himself in such a ruthless environment. This contrast revealed not only love, but also the open wound of someone who felt abandoned by a choice that was not hers. The children, in turn, grew up in the shadow of a myth. For them, their father was both a hero and a painful absence. Later interviews as adults, they recounted remembering small scenes, the smell of his warm clothes, the map spread across the living room, the excitement before each trip. But they also remembered the emptiness of birthdays, the unanswered questions at school, and the nagging feeling that the whole world was talking about their father, but no one knew for sure who he really was. His disappearance didn't just take a man, it took the chance for an ordinary childhood. Conflicts were inevitable among his fellow expedition members. Some argued that the explorer had been reckless, insisting on pushing beyond his limits when he was already visibly exhausted. Others asserted that he was the most prepared of the group, and that his determination should be seen as an example, not a failure. A close colleague even gave a controversial interview, saying that if he hadn't ignored the advice, he would still be alive. This statement fell like a bombshell, further dividing opinions. Was it an unfair accusation or an honest outburst from someone who witnessed his final steps? The authorities also played a central role. On the one hand, there was political pressure to respond to society, as the story had already gained international attention. On the other, there were technical limitations. No matter how much equipment they used, the Andes were relentless in covering their tracks. Some officials declared the case should be closed, considering it an unsolvable tragedy. Others insisted on keeping the search active, fearing that abandoning the search would be interpreted as negligence. This power struggle created internal tensions that inevitably spilled over into the family, and as if that weren't enough, the explorer's longtime rivals and critics emerged. Even before the expedition, people questioned his methods and motivation. Some claimed he sought fame more than knowledge, that his desire to conquer unexplored territories was driven by vanity. Others, on the contrary, argued that he represented the pure spirit of exploration, one who risks one's life in the name of discovery. This clash of narratives transformed the disappearance into a stage for debates about courage, recklessness, and legacy. The shock of these versions intensified the public's doubts. After all, what had really happened? Was it simply a predictable accident, a product of the wild? Or was there something more? Human error, a misguided decision, or even a rivalry that ended in tragedy? Each new testimony seemed to add fuel to the fire, transforming the explorer's absence into a maze of hypotheses. And it was precisely in this environment of pain and conflict that rumors, legends, and disconnected accounts of new clues began to emerge. The silence of the mountain mingled with human voices, which rarely agreed with one another. And as you will see below, these rumors would become fundamental pieces of a seemingly endless puzzle. Time is relentless, but it's also curious. It doesn't erase mysteries, it only transforms them. In the explorer's case, the years following his disappearance didn't bring the expected silence, but rather a chorus of voices that insisted on keeping the flame of the enigma alive. On each anniversary of the lost expedition, newspapers published articles commemorating the tragedy, families lit candles, and curious people fueled discussions in cafes and squares, as if the mountain range still held secrets ready to be revealed. The lack of definitive answers became fertile ground for rumors, hearsay, and even local legends to multiply. Residents of small Andean villages claimed to have seen distant bonfires lit in inaccessible parts of the mountains. Some swore they were merely reflections of the moonlit snow. Others argued they were a sign that someone, perhaps the explorer, was still there, enduring in an almost supernatural way. Over time, reports emerged of objects found on secondary trails, scraps of cloth, rusty tools, an ancient compass that seemed to have belonged to him. For the family, each detail was a spark of hope, proof that perhaps there was still something to be discovered. To the authorities, these were mere coincidences, easily explained as remains from other expeditions. What's truly striking is how the disappearance began to entangle the collective imagination. Stories that the explorer had integrated into isolated Andean communities emerged and gained traction. Some claimed he had chosen not to return, that he had found a new world deep within the mountain range, where life continued at a pace unknown to the rest of civilization. Others, more fanciful, believed he had discovered something that could not be revealed, a secret passage, a mysterious structure, or even traces of ancient cultures still hidden among the peaks. These were unlikely theories, but the lack of concrete evidence meant none could be completely ruled out. Official clues, when they did appear, were rare and fragmentary. Once, a group of climbers found a mark on a rock that appeared recent, as if it had been forcibly engraved with a metal object. The inscription had no clear meaning, but it seemed to bear the signature of someone trying to leave a trail. Another time, a destroyed backpack was found in a remote valley. The wear and tear was consistent with years of exposure, but the details, such as some items still preserved, left researchers divided between the possibility of it being his or that of some other traveler forgotten by history. With each new discovery, the press reignited the issue. Headlines carried phrases like, "New clue reignites mystery in the Andes," or could this be the final trace of the missing explorer? And inevitably the versions clashed. Geography and survival experts asserted that none of it guaranteed its recent arrival. Meanwhile, family members and admirers saw in each object proof that the story was not yet over. This contradiction was enough fuel to prolong collective interest and further deepen the enigma. It's fascinating to observe how the absence of conclusions generates more movement than definitive answers. After all, when something is explained, it loses its mystery, and the public tends to move on. But in the explorer's case, each clue, no matter how disconnected, served to reopen wounds, reignite debates, and spark new theories. It was as if the mountain range had become a stage where reality and imagination blended, and no one knew for sure where one ended and the other began. The effect on the family was devastating, and at the same time paradoxical. On the one hand, the new clues offered hope. On the other, each frustration plunged them deeper into a cycle of pain. His wife, who for years fought to keep his memory alive, confessed in interviews that she no longer knew if she wanted the truth to be discovered. "Sometimes I think it's better not to know, because the truth can be crueler than the mystery," she said, with a distant look in her eyes. This confession revealed the psychological toll of living on a permanent border between absence and expectation. And yet, the mystery seemed unwilling to rest. With each passing decade, the memory returned, always accompanied by something new. A rumor, an object, a belated report from someone claiming to have seen it. Nothing was definitive, but everything was enough to keep the doubt alive. Until, many years later, technology would enter the scene and completely change the course of the narrative. High-resolution satellites, capable of scanning even the most remote regions of the Earth, would capture images that would reignite the case. On a global scale, the satellite images were the turning point. When they finally reached authorities and experts, initial analyses revealed something disturbing. There were indeed clear traces of a human presence in the isolated area of the mountain range. Remains of a camp appeared nearly intact, preserved by the relentless cold. Fragments of fabric, rusty cans, and what appeared to be part of a backpack composed a scene frozen in time. With each detail revealed, what many already suspected was confirmed. The explorer had gone this far, further, than anyone had imagined. Family members received the news with a complex mix of emotions. On the one hand, there was relief at finally having answers, at no longer living at the mercy of rumors or hearsay that fueled impossible hopes. On the other, the pain of confronting the truth. He would not return. His wife, in tears, said in an interview, "Now I know he has become part of the mountain he loved so much." This phrase resonated powerfully, for it was not just regret. It was also a silent acceptance, a form of symbolic justice for those who waited nearly 2 decades for an answer. When releasing the official results, authorities emphasized that the identified location corresponded to an unexplored point in the mountain range, accessible only by extremely difficult routes. There were no signs of foul play or outside interference. Everything indicated that the explorer succumbed to the cold and isolation, trying to survive to the limit. For experts, it was confirmation of his courage and also of his recklessness. But, beyond any judgment, the find represented the return of his memory, rescuing him from the limbo between myth and reality. Most impressive was the impact this discovery had beyond his family. The community of explorers and climbers came to see him as someone who didn't disappear in vain, but who became a symbol of the human spirit in its most extreme form. The desire to move forward even when all signs point to giving up. His name began to be mentioned in conferences, books, and lectures, not as a story of failure, but as a reminder that every step into the unknown exacts a price. And so, after so many years, justice didn't come in court or indictments. It came in the form of recognition. The explorer finally ceased to be merely a painful absence and became part of the very landscape he sought to unravel. The Andes, once guardians of his mystery, now also carried his memory. The explorer's disappearance was never just an individual tragedy. It became a symbol of what has driven humanity since the beginning, the desire to cross boundaries, even when the price is too high. The belated discovery of his remains brought the family a kind of melancholic peace, but also a cruel certainty. He had become part of the mountain he so desperately sought to understand. He did not return home, but remained etched into the Andean landscape, like an eternal scar between rocks and snow. This outcome invites us to reflect on something greater. Why do we insist on challenging the impossible? What drives us to climb mountains, cross oceans, explore space? Perhaps it's the same force that made that man ignore the danger signs and press on. The need to prove, to himself and to the world, that there is something beyond what we already know. This force, at once beautiful and dangerous, is what drives us as a species, but also what confronts us with risks that can consume us. The explorer's memory remains a powerful reminder. Everything we have achieved as humanity was born from the courage of those who dared to go further, even without guarantees of return. The Andes, in this sense, not only swallowed him, they transformed him into legend. And like every legend, he lives on, not only in the records, but in every gaze lost in the immensity of a mountain, in every heart that dreams of unreachable horizons.